We'll give folks a few minutes to sign in and get settled. All right, everyone, welcome to Preview Week for Willamette, the Pinot Noir auction. The wines featured in this tasting series are small lot bottlings for our exclusive trade auction. Contact Emily at the WVWA if you don't know about the auction and you'd like to learn more. I'll put her email address in the chat. For this year's auction, we're pleased to announce a charitable partnership with the James Beard Foundation's Food and Beverage Investment Fund for Black and Indigenous Americans as a part of their Open for Good campaign. All funds raised on auction lots beyond the opening bids, as well as through the paddle race pledge, will go to the investment fund, and I will put their website in the chat as well. I'd like to take a moment as well to thank all our auction sponsors for their ongoing support. And now I'd like to introduce today's featured panelists. Representing Lot 74, Eric Kramer of WillaKenzie Estate. Representing Lot 75, JP Caldcleugh of Union Wine Company. Representing Lot 76, Win Peterson Nedry of RR Wines. Representing Lot 78, Kim Kramer, Kramer Vineyards. And representing Lot 80, Laurent Montelieu of Soléna Estate. And now I'd like to kick it off to our host, David Adelsheim of Adelsheim. David, take it away.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate this opportunity on Thursday to have this illustrious panel and to approach these 5 auction lots. I think the first thing though we should do is take a look at the 2018 vintage because as most of our observers know, this auction contains what, 90 lots that are all from the 2018 vintage. So talking about the general characteristics and then ageability and other aspects, I think is important because it's not just talking about the one lot, but about the entire, all the lots that are in the auction really. So panel, some random thoughts from you about 2018, what it was like to live through, whether you'd ever like to have a vintage like that again.
I hope. Really lovely vintage. I thought it went from a nice, moderately warm summer into a really easy growing season at the end where you could kind of pick and choose when you wanted to harvest. I found a lot of the days from September through October into the mid 70s from what I recall. So it wasn't ripening too quickly, but it was continuing to tick along nicely. So you could kind of say this is the perfect moment to bring in what I want.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I would echo those comments. I really enjoy those vintages where essentially, as you said, when we can kind of pick and choose and, you know, it's very slowly ripening and essentially if it's not getting worse on the vine, it's got to be getting better and you just keep on pushing the maturity level. I recall that 1999 was that way and that was really a very easy vintage. To Dave's point, as far as, you know, what I think about 18, to me, as far as the texture, as far as the body, what it seems to have right now as ageability, it seems to remind me of 2008, which was somehow a little rugged at first, but very, very rapidly became quite silky and very nice. I think we all can agree that we've had a good fortune of having just a plethora of vintages in the 2010 and on that have been really warm and very sunny and with fairly moderate rainfall in the fall, and so this one definitely falls in that realm as well. We're blessed by amazing weather at picking time, which is obviously the biggest challenge for us.
Yeah, so for me, when speaking about the nature of vintages in the Willamette Valley, I'll oftentimes refer to them as user-friendly or user-unfriendly, and I certainly regard 2018 as a user-friendly vintage. echo the 2008 comment, but I feel like there's some similarity between the 2008 vintage, but also somewhat reminiscent of the 2012 vintage. You have some of that fruit intensity that you find in terms of the expression there, but that power, that concentration and nervousness that we found in 2008. So if I could package up two vintages and combine them and ergo comes a 2018, that's not necessarily a bad place to be as far as I'm concerned. And, you know, I think it was a result of that moderate growing season, but also the dry nature of the growing season, creating some real intense concentration, some pretty delicious wines.
Yeah, I'd agree with Eric on the user nature friendliness of the wines, but I think sometimes that can be at the sacrifice of either acidity or tannin. And I think what was unique in my experience with the 2018 vintage was that these wines are beautiful in their youth, but there's some great tannin structure there, and there's some beautiful acidity that we were able to retain because we had a string of cool nights throughout the growing season. And so these wines have a nerve to them. So while they look good in their youth, there is some ageability here, which really makes this vintage stand out in my mind compared to anything we've seen in the past decade.
What I loved about 2018 was that it was just a fun harvest to work. The vintage before 2017 was enormous, and I never want to do a vintage that big with the size of crew that we had ever again. 2018 was just a lot more fun. We really focused on our estate. I like the timeline of things. I really like it when we're picking Pinot in October as we did at our property. And just kind of echoing what everybody else is saying, there's really great balance, ageability. I'm definitely seeing some parallels to the 2008 vintage. In fact, I think 2018 is everything that I hoped 2008 would be, and more. So yeah, it was just a really, really lovely season to make wine.
So what I'm hearing is, go ahead.
That was a good reminder that after 2017, where we're looking for every bucket to ferment our wines into, it was nice to have enough space in the winery to actually, ferment the wine. So thanks for reminding me of that. I hope that it won't be the same this year.
So what I'm hearing is that 2018 was pretty easy for winemakers, that you weren't losing sleep every night. You weren't having to sort of pick around the rainfall like in other vintages. What does this mean in terms of acid, tannin, body, intensity? And what about drinkability today versus long-term drinkability?
Yeah, well, I think, in terms of, the easy nature of the vintage, I mean, I feel like you really had an opportunity to optimize those picking decisions. And, but, in terms of the way the wines express themselves as a function of the growing season, there is absolutely some nerve and energy, some vibrant acidity to these wines, but the tannins are so lovely and sumptuous. The wines, there's a level of balance to these wines, and one of the 08s, they were so powerful and concentrated that they needed time to unfold. I see some of that with these wines, but they're just a little bit more sumptuous and graceful.
And I think from a winemaking standpoint, because we had such a large picking window, because it was so mild, it gave us as winemakers the opportunity to do right by the fruit in the fermenter. In other words, we could go for gentler extractions. I did longer cold soaks because I just had a bigger window. Harvest wasn't compressed for me in 2018. And so I think that allowed for a full expression of the wine. And I think that's going to, give the wines that I was making some great ageability.
I would disagree with everybody. I'm fearing that my vineyard crew might be listening at some point. So nothing easy about that harvest. Don't want to give that impression away. So no, but in all seriousness, it was definitely having the luxury of time is something that we don't often have during harvest. So again, being able to make the choices that everybody mentioned gives you the ability to really think about, you know, which blocks you're going to try to maybe do whole cluster on, which block you're going to let hang a little bit more because past year you decided to pick too early. Anyway, it just gives you that luxury to really put a little bit more thought into the process, and that's always very rewarding.
Yeah, I thought that because we did have that luxury of time, we could pinpoint exactly the styles that we wanted. So if you're going for something a little bit more acid forward and more delicate, you were able to pick a little bit early. And if you wanted to do something a little bit more extracted and a little bit heavy handed, you could let it ripen as long as you wanted, because we did have that luxury. And also coming off of the 2019 vintage, I really enjoyed that luxury of time, because working in a communal space, we are also constrained by when everybody else wants to pick. So if we're a little bit more luxurious about when to bring things in, it makes things a lot easier. So.
And just to add to all of that a little bit, you know, I really think that 2018 has all of the building blocks it needs to age, but I haven't tasted this wine since we bottled it. I'm really happy to be tasting it now. I've been tasting it over the last couple hours in preparation for this call. It's really, really pretty. And usually wines that have, as all of you probably know, the wines that have longevity aren't big and showy at release. You usually get one or the other. And so it's kind of nice to be able to taste the prettiness of it now, but also the potential that it's going to have later.
Yeah, I think the ageability of these wines will be fantastic, because you could fine tune in the vineyard, and then again in the winery with a little bit of added flexibility. So yeah, our wine especially, this is the first time we've done whole cluster in a little while. We don't want to over extract in a hot year, but this was just the right year for us to kind of play with some whole cluster, and it ended up being our favorite lot in the whole winery, and that's why we were able to bottle it up for this auction. We thought it was really special on its own. So yeah, having that flexibility and ability to kind of pick when you want makes all the difference to me.
Any last thoughts on 2018 before we turn to the individual wines? Okay. Eric Kramer, you're up with lot 74 from WillaKenzie Estate.
Thank you, David. So a little bit about WillaKenzie before I get to the wine. So we're located in the Yamhill-Carlton district. The winery itself is named after the soil series on which we're planted. It's a 400-acre estate with just about 100 acres of grapes planted. 75% of that happens to be Pinot Noir, so Pinot rules the day for us here at WillaKenzie. And the vast majority of the estate was planted between 1992 and 1996. So some older mature vines that Laurent actually has had some experience with several years back, and it's great to get a chance to work with them now. To me, some of the defining features at WillaKenzie, it's really about the nature of the topography. It's quite diverse in terms of vertical relief and number of ridge lines and exposures that simply create this broad tapestry from which you get to work with as a winemaker. We actually have 43 parcels, small parcels of Pinot Noir here at the estate. I joined in 2017, but I've been working in the Willamette Valley since 2005. And over the last few years, we've been optimizing, and we now actually have almost one fermenter for every parcel at the estate. So super exciting with some stuff we've got going on. So great to be working for WillaKenzie. So the wine itself. So you may notice kind of the oddball, unusual name, Event Horizon. So what does Event Horizon mean? In the literal sense of the definition? So when we were mulling over a name for this particular wine, we were really thinking about just the depth and density that the nature of the vintage offers. And both me and my associate, I would say we're kind of science geeks. So we referred to some of our background with the sciences, and I actually happen to have my copy of the Physics of Star Trek, signed by William Shatner himself. And so the literal definition of an event horizon is the outer rim of a black hole where the gravity is so intense that the light can't escape. So think about depth, density, power of the vintage, and the gravitational pull of this wine drawing me in there in a way that I simply can't escape the complex nature of this wine. And so—
And do it with a straight face.
Sorry?
Do it with a straight face.
I'm frozen in time. I can't even speak. So this wine, it comes from 4 separate parcels off of the estate, a couple of different parcels of Pomard and a couple of different parcels of 667. Some of that bringing some purity and intensity to the wine, some of that bringing some depth, some brooding layers to the wine, and there's a component that adds just nervous tension to the wine. We make a number of terroir-specific wines from across the estate as part of the WillaKenzie portfolio. So we actually chose some of our choicest parcels from a few different parts of the estate to create a really unique, compelling, and complex wine that we feel really just captured just a lovely expression of the vintage. Stylistically, for me, what we're trying to do at WillaKenzie, it's all about clarity and seamlessness and finesse, but also working with a site that wants to make some pretty savory and powerful wines. So reining them in a little bit through some things that we do in the vineyard as well as in the winery, and working nicely in harmony with the estate in a vintage like 2018. That's what I have.
Thanks so much for that. I really wanted to get into I think that we have to maybe put that on 75. Company, take time with that for us. Well,
David, you cut out for a second. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. JP, would you take us through lot 75 from Union Wine Company?
Yes, sure. So my name is JP Cocklow. I'm the winemaker at Union Wine Company. We are best known, famous, maybe infamous for producing Underwood, which we have put into a can and have gained some notoriety for. That's allowed me as a winemaker to kind of grow our portfolio of vineyards that we choose from, and over the last few years in particular, I've really had the opportunity to work with some great growers. We not only make Underwood, but we make a wine called King's Ridge and a wine called Alchemist as well. And Alchemist is the name of a small lot of Pinot Noir that we make year in and year out, and we also named our auction lot Alchemist this year. It's a name that I love. It evokes these pictures in my mind of chemistry, of kind of the forerunner of chemistry. This idea of tinkering in the lab and really of taking a raw material and transforming it and creating something different, and being able to work with the raw ingredients that we get to in the Willamette Valley with the Pinot Noir that we work with, and transform that into something quite magical and quite spectacular is something I'm grateful to get to do every day. And so I think a really suiting name for the wine. We've been making wine off of these vineyards since the mid-2000s. There's 2 vineyards in this wine, Bass Hill, which is in the McMinnville sub-AVA, the least planted of all the sub-AVAs in the Willamette Valley, and Temperance Hill, a very storied vineyard in the Eola Amity Hills. I chose these 2 vineyards because they're, I think, very different in how they present themselves, how the wines present themselves. And I in past lives worked with a lot of different varieties, worked with a lot of Rhone varieties, and loved the idea of blending and being able to create a complete wine using just different components and different strengths and weaknesses and allowing those to play off of one another. I love making vineyard specific Pinot Noir, but it's fun every once in a while to have the opportunity to play around with, although we're not going outside of the variety of Pinot Noir, playing around with different clones and different vineyard sites. And as the crow flies, these two vineyards aren't very far apart, but they couldn't be two more different wines from the Willamette Valley. So Temperance Hill is an organic dry farm vineyard planted on an old ancient volcano at the crest in the Eola Hills, and has been an amazing site to work with. Working with Di Crisp has been a joy, just with his depth of knowledge and his ability to just manage that vineyard year in and year out to produce some of the best fruit that we work with in the Willamette Valley. Has been a joy. The 777 off of this block is south facing, and no matter how much sun it gets or how warm the year gets, this wine tends to always have some delicacy to it, some really beautiful secondary characteristics, and some beautiful light red fruits, pomegranate, cranberry. And so in the winery, we often will fully destem and really kind of work these grapes to try and extract as much as we can out of them. Bass Hill, on the other hand, over in the McMinnville sub-AVA, is much smaller berries, thicker skins, and tends to produce these really big burly wines that have a depth of concentration, but not just concentration as far as the fruit profile goes, but also acidity as well. And these wines take some taming. In 2018, we did a lot of whole cluster fermentation on these wines and still had some pretty burly big tannin. Having these two melded together in the bottle, I think allows for some beautiful red fruit expression, but also some depth of concentration and some acidity that gives this wine a tension and just an intriguing quality that it makes it a really fun wine to drink. So yeah, cool. It's been a blast making it.
Thank you. Wynn Peterson Edred, could you tell us about lot 76 from your winery, RR?
You bet. Yeah. So our winery is called RR Winery, also known as Ribbon Ridge Winery. It was started in 2002 by my father, Harry Peterson Nedry, who I am now partnered with in this long-term project. We had the first vintage of 2018 in our new winery facility. So as I'd mentioned earlier, we're making wine in a shared facility. So some of the logistics of that are always fun to kind of play around with a little bit, but also get to bounce ideas off of other winemakers while at that facility. So it's fun to have kind of a collaborative nature during harvest, and I enjoy some of that. The vineyard itself is called Ridgecrest. Ridgecrest is the oldest vineyard in what's now known as Ribbon Ridge AVA. It's the smallest little viticultural area in the Willamette Valley and in Oregon, and probably has one of the higher concentrations of vineyards planted there. I don't know exactly what it is at this time, but there are new ones going in all the time, and we just planted ourselves a couple more acres this year. So, but we've got 120 acres of land up there, 40 of which is planted. And of that, about 28 is Pinot Noir. So we do some great Pinot Noirs, but also play around with some Gamay and some whites. This lot in particular came from what are the oldest vines on Ribbon Ridge now. So planted in 1982, these are 36-year-old vines at the time of harvest. This is Pomard clone exclusively. The lot came entirely from one single fermentation that I did in 2018. It was 30% whole cluster, and it was the last Pinot that we picked. So kind of at the very top of the hill, the elevation's like 650 feet up there, and we get really nice breezes every evening that cool things down. The diurnal flux up there every summer and fall day can vary from, you know, a high of 90, 95 on a hot day and cool down to about 60 at night. So always get some really nice cooling breezes, helps retain acidity up there. So even though we get some bigger fruit, if you're familiar with Ribbon Ridge fruit in general, it tends to be a little bit blacker fruit, darker, dusty fruit, black tea leaf, that kind of thing. And you definitely see all of that in this wine too. It's also got a really nice spice to it. So I brought in the fruit at the end of September. It was the last Pinot we brought in, and then did a long cold soak and about 30% whole cluster. Really gentle with the punch downs. I didn't want to extract too much because it was, as we've had in the last 5 or 6 years, a relatively warm vintage. So just to keep that delicacy is really important for me. And then we chose this blend from our 2 favorite barrels. So we picked our 2 favorite barrels from that one fermenter, one of which was new, one of which was not, and mixed them together and made this wine. So we called it Invictus. Invictus is a poem. My dad, having been a chemistry and English double major, and myself a chemistry major and poetry minor, we kind of get along in that sense of things. Lots of data, but also lots of reading things. So if you want to look it up, it's a poem by William Ernest Henley. So definitely talks about kind of the darkness of night, but it's the darkness of wine for us in this case. So definitely has some inky components and really pretty from the, like I said, the oldest vines up there on Ribbon Ridge that I'm fortunate enough to get to work with every year.
Super, Win. Thank you, and thanks for explaining why this wine is called Invictus.
Of course.
I think we should move on to lot 78 from Kramer Vineyards. Kim Kramer is the winemaker.
Yes, thank you. So this is a wine from our estate property that my folks developed starting in 1983 from a raw piece of land in the north end of what is now the Yamhill Carlton AVA. And when they started, there was no road, no vineyard, no vineyards, no plumbing, nothing. And they built everything up themselves, planting 1,000 vines a year for the first 5 years, eventually growing to 22 acres of vines with 27 blocks that scattered throughout. And it's interesting, that tapestry comment from Eric earlier. I think of our vineyard as being this patchwork quilt with these tiny blocks all sewn together throughout. So as I mentioned before, we're in Yamhill Carlton, so we have sedimentary soils. I did not want to make wine until kind of later in my 20s, but growing up on the property, I certainly know what ripe flavors taste like, and I think that's a huge asset to me now. I can't tell you how many grapes I consume from both of these sites, and so getting really familiar with the flavors of ripeness and what really developed flavor in Pinot Noir tastes like. So I kind of went away, worked at St. Innocent, got a big love for sparkling wine there, and then eventually came back to take on winemaking responsibilities at the family's property. And it wasn't until 2010 when I went to Burgundy where I had a really clear idea of what I wanted to do with the Pinot Noir program, and then also saw the advantage of having all of these separate blocks that have these really unique stressors or clonal material or slope, or these very slight differences in soil type that add up to these very unique flavor profiles. And so that kind of leads into our lot, the Gemini lot. It's a blend of 2 blocks. We have the original block that was planted in '84, that's all Pomard clone on classic 5x10 spacing, sits at an elevation of 725 feet. So it's really easy slope with very even ripeness, about a full acre in size. And this Pinot tends to age really well. Even now we can go back to wines that my folks made in the early 90s and find so much life in those wines. And so for me, that's what's really exciting about making Pinot Noir from that same that same parcel now is that hopefully I've learned enough where I can be able to make a wine that we can taste in 20 or 30 years and still find plenty to enjoy and appreciate. And maybe our understanding of the vintage will have greatly evolved by then as well. And then the other parcel that's part of this blend is what we call Cardiac Hill. That's the steepest hillside of vines that we have on the property. It's on the south end, a little lower in elevation. Has Pomard and a little bit of 115, and is also about an acre in size. But this block, in addition to being steep, it's on a tree line. The soil is very, very different. There's not a whole lot of top layers. There's a lot of, and it's spotty too. So there's this real uneven spectrum of ripeness that we get from that hillside. And so, so it's interesting, even though these blocks are really, really close together, one on the north end, one on the south end, the flavor profiles that we get from these two properties are very, very different. So our original block is earthy and very structured, whereas the steep hillside, the younger block, tends to be more overtly fruity and floral by comparison. And so we usually don't blend these together. It was my sister's idea to do this blend for the auction. And so we selected our two favorite barrels. She was expecting at the time we did the blend, so I thought it'd be really cool to take advantage of her hyper pregnant lady palate. And so both in the barrel selection process and then in the blending process, she was really integral to that because she's hypersensitive to things that I might not know about. So we selected Gemini because it's a 2-block, 2-barrel, 2-sister blend. Also, we're mistaken for twins all the time. And so it just kind of made sense to name it that.
Thus, Gemini as a name.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Lot 80 from Soléna Estate. Laurent, could you talk to that, please?
sure. So just a little bit about the history of our brand and myself a little bit. I've had the good fortune of sharing winemaking with all my Oregon peer winemakers since 1988, which has been a wonderful journey, and really appreciate everything that I've learned from all our cool winemakers here, and it's been just amazing. I started in the southern part of the state of Oregon. It was a winery called Bridgeview, and as Eric alluded to, I was fortunate enough that at some point Bernie Lacroute essentially handed me the project of WillaKenzie to start and develop, and that was just, again, a beautiful journey. But after a few years, I realized that I wanted to be a master of my own domain, and I wanted to be just focusing on Pinot Noir and doing a very small amount of wine. And so Soléna was born. So Soléna is actually, the daughter was born first, and so we named the winery after our daughter, and then the brand and the estate was following thereafter very shortly. The concept of being an estate winery was very important to us. So from the get-go, all the practices that we've had have been completely organic. And since 2004, we've embarked on the journey of biodynamism, which again has been just really wonderful, very eye-opening. I think for the naysayer amongst you, which I'm sure there's a few, I wish we could meet in about 150 years, and I know that I would be able to explain what is going on in some of the practices. At this point, I cannot, so you just have to believe it. And, we certainly have done a lot of experiments. I was fortunate enough to do one of the largest experiments side by side in Yamhill, Carlton, of a property that was planted with sustainable practices versus biodynamism. And we definitely had some pretty dramatic differences. And so the fact that it's different to me is the most important. And I like the fact that hopefully I will be leaving the property to my daughter in better shape that I took it on. And that's, if nothing else, that's a beautiful part of the journey. So yeah, as far as being a garagiste, a very small producer winery, that kind of went a little by the wayside. When I left WillaKenzie, I wanted to make 800 cases of wine and no more. And now we've evolved a little bit with some of our holdings as far as property and vineyards. We own about 700 acres of vineyard, and we've developed a winery facility in Dundee that makes about 250,000 cases. So it's changed a little bit. So it's evolved in the business model, but certainly appreciate that that it's been fun. And we have the capability of keeping all the very small lots separated. And in 2018, I had realized for a long time that we had one clone planted on the Domaine Daniel Laurent. So, we named the winery after Soléna, the daughter. It was time that mom, Danielle, and myself, dad, had their name on the label as well. So that's what we refer as Domaine Daniel Laurent, which is the first 5-acre property that we planted that was actually from gifted vines from friends and family. When we got married, we had plenty of forks and knives and all the things that you usually register for. So we actually registered for vines. So the original Domaine Daniel Laurent is kind of our wedding plot. And within that wedding plot, I had a great diversity of clones. And one of the clones that was planted was the Swan clone that came from a trip to California with Tony Soder. Tony had cleaned up a version of that Swan clone at Etude and was generous enough to kind of give access to our cellar club members, cellar crawl members, sorry. It's a small group of us that would go down and visit each other's cellars. And so we had access to that clone. I planted it, and quite frankly, was always a little disappointed in that clone up until I realized that it made a fantastic blender when it was blended with Pomar. And so the lot and the wine that you're tasting is a blend of that Pomar and that Swan clone. To me, the Swan clone on its own is a little rugged, a little unfinished, not polished enough. But when I'm able to co-ferment it with that Pomar, it seems to really refine the edges and make a wine that has a great sense of place. And again, that's the challenge, and that's what I'm trying to do with our wines. I mean, we share a property line with Dick Shea. We're very close to WillaKenzie. Penarash is right in the back of us. We definitely want to make a wine that has that sense of place. And hopefully you'll see over the years as you taste the wines that you find that minerality, that earth, that mushroom component that I think has become typical of what I describe as our estate wines. So hopefully you see that as well in that wine. For me, it's been consistently there. And then hopefully, again, you will see it as well. So hope you enjoy it.
Super. One of the minor problems to doing a digital auction is we're all sitting here salivating over each other's lots, but not able to taste them. So hopefully everybody's saving lots so that post-COVID we can all get together and try some. We've discussed the individual lots. We've talked about the vintage. I think it's time for a few questions, although I don't see anything up in the chat or the Q&A. Julia, what do you know?
So yeah, folks, if you have questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A, but I have one. One of the things that I find myself talking to people about a lot with Willamette Valley Pinot is how amazingly age-worthy it is, more so than I think a lot of people realize. I'm curious, when you think back at some of your favorite vintages, when you look at your own wines, especially wines from the site that your auction wine this year is from, how much of a difference is there between one vintage and another in terms of when you would want to drink them? Do you always like to drink your wines at 5 years old or 10 years old? And what are the biggest factors that influence that for you?
I'll start. I think that our Pinots reliably reach a really great first window at the 5 to 7 year mark after vintage date. But most of them can go a lot further than that, but that just seems to be a really nice, reliable first peak. And then depending on the building blocks of that vintage, most of them can go 10, 20. I've been really surprised at how many 30-year wines that we made from our property when our vineyard was younger, and we knew far less about how to make wine than we do right now. And that's why, working with vines that have more developed root systems and learning more about how to farm our own property and work with our own fruit, I have so much more confidence now in those wines that are already performing really, really well. But anyway, just to go back to that 5 to 7 year, that seems to be pretty consistent from vintage to vintage, even though we've had some years that have swung wildly in personality recently.
Yeah, Julie, I think that, the 5 to 7 years was answering, maybe from my standpoint, maybe your question about where do I like some of my Pinots the best. I definitely like that window because it still has some really bright fruit. It has some of the primary aromatics, but it started to evolve a little bit more in the earth, the mushroom, the component that come with ageability. Now, one other part of your question, I think, addresses the longevity of the wines of Oregon and of the Willamette Valley in particular. And it's been an amazing surprise, I think, to a lot of us that we've discovered as the wine were aging, that not only were they still alive, but they were just getting better and better. And I had the good fortune of tasting a 2003 a couple nights ago that was still bright and alive. The tannins were still massive. I mean, that was a very, very hot vintage, one of the first really hot ones we had. But nevertheless, the wines were still spectacular, and that evolved was adding some musk and some, wild gamey component to the wine that, I don't think when we made the wine, we anticipated that this was going to develop into those beautiful aromatics. So I think Oregon, and again, the Willamette Valley, is showing some amazing ability to age wine. And that's really encouraging.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Laurent and Kim both just said, as well as one of the new questions that just popped up. I think not only does vintage affect the ageability somewhat, I think vine age does too. And one of the reasons that I think things keep getting better and better, like Laurent said, is because our vineyards here in the Willamette Valley consistently get older and older as we wait a little bit longer. So we're having more wines from older vintages, or from older vines, show up. And well, we're also all just getting better at making wine, right? So it helps in both of those terms. But yeah, for a consistent vintage window, 5 to 7 years is really reliable. But if you have a slightly cooler vintage, sometimes those even last longer. But like Laurent was saying, it's kind of a crapshoot. Sometimes the 2003s that are really hot are still amazingly beautiful 20 years later. And sometimes those really cool vintages take that long to really open up. So it's vintage dependent, it's vine age dependent. I think as the vines get older and they seek out their own nutrients and water way down deep, they can survive weather swings a lot more flexibly than younger vines that are still kind of closer to the surface with their roots.
We might be getting better, but I think in the early 70s, they were doing an amazing job. So Dave, right at you, what is the vintage that you're the proudest of, and what do you remember of that particular vintage? In the 70s, I'm putting you on the spot, come on.
No kidding. I only made 2 wines from the 70s, 78 and 79, but 78 for us was like the most overripe wine we ever made because it was small crop, young vines, and we had no idea that grapes could get overripe in the Willamette Valley. Amazingly enough, though, when we had that wine at our 40th anniversary party in, what was that, would have been 2011, the wine had survived in some sense. Eric, you were there. We were sort of amazed that this wine with very low acidity was really not over the hill.
That was one of my reasons for my call. I missed it, so I just looking forward to tasting that wine with you, Dave.
That'll be his contribution to our WVWA get-together when COVID's over.
I think we almost used up every bottle.
See how convenient his internet connection is giving up on him?
Yep.
We didn't wine.
I'll translate for David. He's gonna...
I think he said they're out of bottles.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
There he is.
good. So there are a couple of more questions in the chat. Marissa wanted to know the perfect pairing for the perfect dish to pair with each of your wines. And maybe we can do a quick round robin. If you have something that, given what your wine is like today or will be like soon, what you would put with, in essence, a young Pinot.
I can go first. My wife and I actually braved a trip. We road trip down to New Orleans, where I'm from, and that's where I'm speaking from right now. And I brought 2 bottles down, and had a bottle of my wine with crawfish etouffee the other night, and it went incredibly well. That richness from that butter. And that little bit of spiciness really complemented the wine well. I think it could have equally gone well with a big piece of meat. So a very versatile wine. But yeah, try it with crawfish.
It wasn't so much the crayfish as it was in essence, the sauce that made it
Yes.
work with your Pinot.
Yeah.
Good. Others?
I'll go next. The Ribbon Ridge is classically pretty deep and dark, but one of my favorite pairings of all time is a really nice seared duck breast. So something just a little bit gamier and a little bit richer than, say, any kind of other poultry or fish, all the way up to gamier meats. But I would say a really great grilled duck breast with like a cherry compote, one of those pairings where you've got some fruit present as well as a little bit of char or a little bit of smoke. I think that's a really great pairing for this wine because we always get a little bit of spice. I always do like a little Asian 5 spice with that too, and that complements kind of the black tea characteristics and some of the clove, anise, cinnamon type of aspects that we get from this vineyard.
As the French one on the panel here, I think, one of my perfect match is always matching fish and Pinot Noir, because that's almost still a no-no in France, which is really surprising. But in general, what I would say is that the beauty of Pinot Noir, it pairs well with almost everything. So I would probably work on the surroundings and who you're going to invite to the table a bit more than what you're going to pair it with.
Well said.
Yeah, for me, the 18s, there's, just in terms of that generosity, and the opulence, for me, like right now, I'm thinking about waiting for a few months until it starts to get a little bit chilly outside, throwing a log onto the fire and putting my cast iron cooktop on the stove and pan searing some lamb and digging in and enjoying it wholeheartedly.
So I think with this combination of acidity, tannin, and generous fruit, cassoulet, and also waiting to the fall on that. But yeah, that's my favorite post-harvest party dish. I would like to open some of our 18s with that.
Super. I think we did a good job on parsing that question. There's another, do you think biodynamic farming can influence wine ageability? Those
Good question.
with that experience?
In my experience of doing a side-by-side, what we've noticed in the wines that were biodynamically grown versus sustainably grown is that we had a lot more structure, we had a concentration, we had an intensity that was a little bit greater. So I'm not putting any kind of qualitative comparison, but just the amount of tannins and the amount of concentration seems to be greater, mostly in the biodynamically farmed vines. So I would assume that having a little bit more tannin, have a little bit more structure, you would extend the ageability as well of those wines.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, again, I think I give you a meeting in about 150 years, right? So
Right, I'll wait for that.
No, but I think, some of this thing is really what we've watched in the vineyard is a lot of balance. And so a lot of the activities that we do have to do, of course, with balancing the cycle of a lot of planets that influence the vegetal world. but also we use a lot of tea combinations that are interestingly affecting the vines, and it's something that we could visually see. Some of the teas that we're spraying right now are chamomile, and chamomile is a very soothing, very calming effect to the body of humans. Some of us, might enjoy a chamomile infusion at night to just kind of put you to sleep. Similarly, in the vineyard, we see when they're bigger, and we had a very wet June, so we're still seeing a little bit of reminiscence of the water moisture in. Sorry, I'm getting dark here. The water moisture in the ground, and so we are spraying those elements right now. So again, for me, the balance of the vines is what we're able to achieve by farming, following some practices that our great-grandparents used to know. I mean, they did particular things to the vegetable world at certain times that we've all heard about, but that we've lost track of and that we don't practice anymore. So I think balance of the vine is what I see the most in the vineyards that are biodynamically farmed.
Mm-hmm.
So, Julia, do you have perhaps one more question for us to throw out?
I do. This question came through in registration, and I thought it was a good one for this group in particular. Where do you see, this is kind of a job interview question, but not for you guys, fortunately. Everyone hates it. Where do you see Oregon Pinot Noir in the next 5 years? What are the things you're most excited about? What are the biggest challenges you see? What are the conversations that you think we're going to be having?
I don't know about, I mean, some of these larger producers can probably speak to bigger trends, but I'm really interested in whole cluster. I've been dabbling in whole cluster since 2012. I've done several structured trials with it, not just different amounts of whole cluster, but having insulated bins versus not insulated bins, and so for me, I'm gonna roll with that. I love whole cluster. Our auction lot, 50% whole cluster in the fermentation. I'm trying to figure out how much whole cluster each vintage needs. That's only something that's going to continue.
I think we keep on growing, we keep on learning. The industry is so collaborative. So at the high end of the spectrum, when we make those very unique, very small lots, we put a lot of intent in it, and we put a lot of reflection. We share a lot of practices with friends. So that's a really exciting thing. So I see that continuing on, which is just beautiful. I also see Oregon and Willamette Valley Pinot Noir becoming more readily available. And I think, Union, thank you, A to Z, thank you, all the people that are really kind of putting Pinot Noir in the mouths of the sommeliers, of the people that enjoy by the glass wines on a regular basis. I think that's tremendous. We represent a very small part of the market. Pinot Noir is growing exponentially. And so us as Oregonian and people from the Willamette Valley producing some great wines that people can afford on a regular basis is really exciting. So I commend everybody that is doing both the very best effort to make the very best wine possible, but also kind of making wines that people can afford on a regular basis is really, really rewarding, I think.
Yeah, I'd echo. Sorry. I'd echo what Laurent's saying in that this is an incredibly collaborative region. I made wine outside of Oregon for the 15 years of my career leading up to moving up here. And one thing that always impressed me was how much camaraderie, how much sharing of information and best practices was happening in the Willamette Valley. We're such a small, tight-knit group of people that best practices can proliferate pretty quickly. And if you put that on top of, as Wynn spoke to earlier, these older vines, we're such a young area, but as we're starting to get some age on some of these older vines, we're seeing some intensity of, we're seeing impressive fruit quality, and then you're laying on top of that these building blocks of winemaking as we all work more collaboratively and learn more from one another. And so we've already got an amazing foundation to build on, and I continue to see this area shining, and it's fun to be a part of, for sure.
it is fun to be a part of. It's been really neat to see the progressive the wines here have been great here for a long time, but they have absolutely continued to get better, and all producers are continuing to make better wines, and it's been such a neat thing to see. And that's not just winemaking. It's even I've been here for 15 years, and seeing how viticulture has evolved over the last 15 years in terms of different approaches to managing some of the challenges that we see during the growing season, and how challenging growing seasons were handled 10, 12 years ago. It's not the same as say a vintage we just had in 2019, which, mind you, those were yummy wines, some of my favorites in recent memory. But to see that continual progression in terms of how things can get handled, continuing to make great wine, and that'll continue to bolster the reputation for the region. And it's exciting to be in the Willamette Valley now, and it'll be even more exciting 5 years from now.
I look forward to the day when we can go out and enjoy each other's wines again in restaurants and with friends and in the industry and travel. So that's what I think happens.
Hopefully that's not in 5 years.
Less than 5 years.
Yeah.
Within it.
That was the question. There's one last question up on the chat from Melody. Does transparent wine have less intensity? Because in essence, big wines would mask the characteristics of terroir. So if your wine is going to be transparent and show the terroir, does it have to be less intense?
I think Melody had more than 3 questions. We should cut her off. Plus, the last one is really complicated. So
I think transparency has more to do with Pinot Noir than terroir necessarily. I think Pinot Noir is a delicate grape to begin with. So by making it too heavy-handedly, it can mask some of the beautiful delicate aromatics of violets and light cherries and things like that are present in Pinot Noir to begin with. Whether your terroir is heavier or lighter, it can kind of mask that as well a little bit, but I think more than terroir, it would mask the Pinot Noir fruit itself. I think it's meant to be a little bit lighter and more elegant and acid forward and fresh, more than it is supposed to be like a Cabernet or a Syrah or something.
And I think it depends on what you consider intensity. I don't know that wines necessarily have to be big to be intense. I think a wine can be transparent and also hold tension and hold some intensity to them in maybe a more delicate way. And I think it depends on what you call intensity.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to be drawing things to a close. I want to point out that this auction is normally a trade auction, meaning you have to be in the wine trade to buy the wines and sell them. And that this year, that is true, but part of the price that is paid above the base price for each of these lots will actually go to the James Beard Foundation. And so this is both a trade auction and a charitable auction. And in fact, when we sort of were finishing up, excuse me, some of the details for this auction, the James Beard Foundation had created a new and permanent fund that grew really out of what has happened since Memorial Day, the George Floyd murder, and is really a fund that helps both Black and Indigenous American owners of restaurants and other establishments in the food and wine business financially, and is basically an investment to help these kinds of establishments, which traditionally have not had access to the wealth that other food and wine businesses have had, helps them get established and move forward. So it's really great that the Willamette Valley Wineries Association has been able to partner with the James Beard Foundation in making this happen, and I think we feel very privileged to that. I want to then take this moment to thank Eric, JP, Wynn, Kim, and Laurent for taking this hour and some great amount of time before this to get ready for this hour together with the attendees at this seminar. I learned a lot, and I appreciate the insights that you've given me to the general 18 vintage, but also your take in the wines that you've made. I really look forward to trying the wines with you, not 5 years from now, not 2 years from now, but even sooner. And thank all the attendees for spending the time with us. Thanks so much. Back to you, Juliet.
Thank you so much, David, and panelists, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today. All of you joining us from all over the place, thank you so much for being here with us. And I dropped the link to register to bid if you are trade and you have not done so yet. Our auction is next week, August 11th, 12th, and 13th, with a live close on August 13th. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, everyone, and cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.